In my 15 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I had learned to keep my work life and home life strictly separate. Most of my neighbors had no idea what I did for a living, and that was exactly how I wanted it. After days spent tracking down criminals and building federal cases, coming home to my quiet suburban neighborhood was my escape, my sanctuary from the darkness I confronted daily. At the center of that sanctuary sat my pride and joy, a 1967 Ford Mustang in cherry red. It was not just a car to me. It was a connection to my father who had taught me everything I knew about engines before he passed away. We had started restoring it together when I was 16, and after his sudden heart attack, I spent the next decade finishing what we had started, sourcing original parts and teaching myself what he no longer could teach me. Every weekend spent underneath that car was a conversation with his memory. Every turn of a wrench was a promise kept. When I finally took it for its first drive after restoration, I swear I could feel him in the passenger seat, grinning as the engine roared to life. That car was not transportation. It was a time machine, a memory vault, the last project I would ever share with my dad. My job required relocation every few years, and the Mustang always came with me, carefully transported to each new beginning. This latest move brought me to Oak Hills Estates, a planned community with cookie-cutter houses distinguishable only by slight variations in paint color and landscaping. But the neighborhood had good security, reasonable prices, and most importantly, a two-car garage where my Mustang could safely reside. The first few weeks were pleasant enough. I met several neighbors who seemed friendly if somewhat reserved. There was Tom and Lisa next door, a retired couple who brought me a homemade pie. Across the street was Marcus, a fellow car enthusiast who admired the Mustang from a respectful distance. A few houses down lived the Patels, who invited me to a backyard barbecue my first weekend there. It was at that barbecue that I first heard about the Homeowners Association and its infamous president, Diane Keller. The neighbors spoke about her in hushed tones, their eyes darting around as if she might appear at the mention of her name. She fined the Johnsons $1,000 for having their trash cans out 12 hours too long, Mrs. Patel whispered, sipping her lemonade nervously. And poor old Mr. Williams had to remove his bird feeders. She claimed they were unauthorized structures, Marcus added with a shake of his head. I nodded politely but thought little of it. In my profession, I dealt with actual criminals, people who caused real harm. How bad could one neighborhood busybody be? My first encounter with Diane came 3 days later. I had taken the Mustang out for a Sunday drive and parked it in my driveway upon return, planning to wash it before putting it back in the garage. I was just gathering my cleaning supplies when a sharp voice cut through the peaceful afternoon. "Excuse me, that vehicle cannot remain in the driveway." I turned to see a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with HOA President embroidered on the chest. Her face was set in a practiced expression of polite disapproval, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "I am Diane Keller, president of the Oak Hills Estates Homeowners Association," she continued, not waiting for my response. "According to Covenant Section 12, Paragraph 3, no vehicle maintenance or washing is permitted in driveways, and no vehicles may be parked outside overnight." I introduced myself politely, explaining that I was just about to wash the car and then return it to the garage. Her eyes narrowed as she assessed both me and the Mustang, making notes on her clipboard. "Classic cars must be registered with the HOA Architectural Committee," she stated flatly. "There are special provisions and additional fees for non-standard vehicles. I will have the paperwork sent to you immediately." Without waiting for my response, she pivoted and walked away, her posture rigid with authority. As I watched her marching down the street, stopping occasionally to make notes about other properties, I had the distinct feeling I had just encountered someone who thrived on control and power, someone who would soon become much more than a minor annoyance in my peaceful new life. The notices began arriving 3 days after my first encounter with Diane. The first was a formal warning about the Mustang being parked in the driveway without proper registration with the HOA. The second, which arrived just 1 day later, cited my grass as being 1/4 inch too high according to Section 8 of the Community Guidelines. The third notice, slipped into my mailbox before I had even addressed the first two, stated that my mailbox did not meet the approved style requirements despite being identical to every other mailbox on the street. Each letter was typed in the same rigid format, violation at the top, reference to specific bylaw section in the middle, and consequences at the bottom. The tone grew increasingly threatening with each notice. What began as friendly reminders quickly escalated to final warnings and mentions of financial penalties. I completed the registration paperwork for the Mustang, paid the specialty vehicle assessment fee of $200, and made sure my lawn was impeccably maintained. As an FBI agent, I was accustomed to following rules and protocols, but even to me, these seemed excessive and arbitrarily enforced. My suspicions were confirmed when Tom and Lisa invited me over for coffee one evening. Their living room was cozy, filled with family photos and comfortable furniture well worn from decades of use. "We need to warn you about Diane," Lisa said quietly, glancing toward the window as if the HOA president might be lurking in the bushes. "She targets newcomers, tests their boundaries." Tom nodded solemnly. The Hendersons moved out after just 6 months, could not take the harassment. Their son put up a basketball hoop, a removable one, mind you, and she had the association fine them daily until they took it down. "The worst was what happened to Dr. Rodriguez," Lisa continued. "She had a small medical practice and sometimes saw patients in her home office. Diane claimed it violated zoning restrictions and reported her to the city." "Did it actually violate zoning laws?" I asked, my investigator instincts perking up. Tom shook his head. "Not at all, but by the time that was established, Dr. Rodriguez had spent thousands in legal fees and lost patients. She moved her practice and home to a different neighborhood." Over the next hour, they shared more stories about residents who had crossed Diane and suffered consequences ranging from public humiliation at HOA meetings to mysterious property damage that could never quite be traced back to her. "Why does nobody stand up to her?" I asked. Lisa sighed. "She has been president for 8 years. Nobody runs against her. The few who tried found themselves with multiple violation notices and fines. Plus, she has 2 friends on the board who vote with her on everything." I thanked them for the information and walked home deep in thought. The situation reminded me of small-time crime bosses who controlled neighborhoods through intimidation rather than outright violence. It was petty tyranny, but tyranny nonetheless. My contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Diane standing in my driveway, examining my garage door with a frown. The Mustang was safely inside, but apparently that was not enough to avoid scrutiny. "Is there a problem?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite my growing irritation. "Your garage door has a dent in the lower panel," she stated without greeting me. "Section 15 requires all visible home features to be maintained in pristine condition." I looked at the barely perceptible indentation near the bottom of the door. It had likely been there since before I moved in. "I will address it this weekend," I replied calmly. "See that you do," she said, making another note on her ever-present clipboard. "And in the future, that car should remain in the garage. Even with registration, extended driveway parking is discouraged." "The covenant says vehicles cannot be parked outside overnight," I countered. "It does not prohibit daytime parking in one's own driveway." Her eyes narrowed at my challenge. "I am very familiar with the regulations, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps you should read the fine print about the Architectural Committee's discretionary authority." "I will review it carefully," I assured her, maintaining professional composure despite the unnecessary confrontation. "See that you do," she repeated, turning to leave. "This neighborhood has standards. We all make sacrifices to maintain property values." She paused, looking back with what almost seemed like a threat gleaming in her eyes. "Those who cannot adapt tend not to stay long." As she walked away, I realized I was employing the same controlled breathing techniques I used during tense standoffs in my professional life. Despite my desire to keep my worlds separate, it seemed Diane Keller was determined to test every ounce of my FBI-trained patience. Monday mornings were always difficult after weekend off-duty time, but this particular morning promised to be better than most. The weather forecast showed clear skies, perfect for driving the Mustang to work instead of my standard-issue government sedan. It was a small indulgence I allowed myself once or twice a month, a reminder that life existed outside of surveillance operations and criminal investigations. I stepped outside with my travel mug of coffee, briefcase in hand, ready to begin the week. The garage door hummed as it lifted, revealing the first glint of chair. Red paint in the morning sunlight, but something was wrong. The light reflected differently, interrupted by a jagged line that had not been there before. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the concrete as I rushed forward. A deep gash ran the entire length of the passenger side, cutting through paint down to bare metal in some places. The pristine finish my father and I had so carefully applied was now marred by a vicious wound that could only have been deliberately inflicted. I circled the car in shock, each new discovery hitting like a physical blow. All 4 tires had been slashed, the valve stems completely removed to ensure they could not be simply reinflated. The driver's side mirror hung limply, connected only by internal wiring, and scratched into the hood, barely visible but unmistakable when caught in the right light, was a single word: move. For several minutes I stood motionless, a storm of emotions churning inside me. Grief for the damage to my most precious possession, rage at the violation, and beneath it all, a cold, familiar focus beginning to take shape. The same mental state that allowed me to methodically build cases against the worst criminals. I took a deep breath and engaged my training. This was now a crime scene. I retrieved my phone and documented everything with meticulous detail, each scratch, each slashed tire, the broken mirror, and the message on the hood. I examined the garage door and surrounding areas, noting that the security system had not been triggered. This suggested the garage had been entered either by someone who knew the code or through the side door, which I sometimes left unlocked during the day. After calling into work to request an emergency personal day, I set up my home security cameras to download the previous night's footage. The system had been installed but not yet activated, a crucial oversight I now deeply regretted. Next, I walked the neighborhood, knocking on doors to ask if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual overnight. Most neighbors expressed shock and sympathy, though I noticed fear in many of their eyes, as if they suspected who might be responsible but were too afraid to say it aloud. It was Marcus, my fellow car enthusiast from across the street, who finally provided concrete information. "Check with the Wilsons at the end of the block," he suggested quietly. They installed a doorbell camera after their holiday decorations were vandalized last year. The Wilsons were initially hesitant but became more forthcoming when I explained the situation. Mrs. Wilson pulled up the previous night's footage on her phone, scrolling through hours of nothing until approximately 2:17 a.m. There, moving across the edge of the frame, was a figure in dark clothing carrying what appeared to be a key or similar sharp object. "Can you enhance this section?" I asked, falling back on professional habits. Mrs. Wilson apologized that the basic doorbell camera did not have such capabilities, but even with the limited resolution, the figure's distinctive gait was recognizable. The same stiff-backed, purposeful stride I had observed during my encounters with Diane Keller. "Would you be willing to save this footage?" I asked, "and possibly provide a statement if needed later?" Mrs. Wilson glanced nervously at her husband before nodding reluctantly. "We have 6 months left on our mortgage," she whispered. "After that, we are selling and moving closer to our grandchildren. Until then, please do not tell anyone we showed you this." I honored their request for discretion and returned home, my investigator's mind now fully engaged. In my dining room, I created a makeshift case board similar to those we used at the bureau. Timeline along the top, known facts in the center, suspicions and leads along the bottom. The Mustang remained in the garage, too damaged to drive, a constant reminder of the malice directed at me. Instead of having it towed to a body shop immediately, I decided to leave it exactly as it was, evidence preserved in situ. Professional experience told me that acting too quickly might alert the perpetrator and cause them to cover their tracks more carefully in the future. That night, I installed additional security cameras with night vision capabilities, motion sensors on all access points to my property, and a more sophisticated alarm system. If Diane or anyone else attempted to trespass again, I would have irrefutable evidence. As I finished securing my home well past midnight, I made a conscious decision. I would not confront Diane immediately, despite the burning desire to do so. Instead, I would build a case methodically and thoroughly, the same approach that had served me well throughout my FBI career. This was no longer just about a car or petty neighborhood politics. This was criminal vandalism motivated by abuse of power, and I would treat it with the same seriousness as any federal investigation. The Mustang might be wounded, but it had just become the catalyst for something much larger than either Diane Keller or the HOA could possibly anticipate. The dining room table disappeared beneath case files, notebooks, and investigation materials as days turned into weeks. The Mustang remained in the garage, damaged but untouched, a daily reminder of my purpose. I had arranged for a rental car to commute to work, explaining to colleagues that my vehicle needed extensive repairs after an unfortunate incident. My investigation began with thorough background research on Diane Keller. Public records revealed she had moved to Oak Hills Estates 12 years ago and became HOA president within 4 years of arrival. Prior to that, she had lived in 3 different planned communities, each time serving on the board before abruptly relocating. This pattern raised questions about whether similar situations had occurred elsewhere. The HOA financial records proved more difficult to obtain, but were not impossible for someone with my training. As a resident and member of the association, I had legal rights to review certain documents. When my initial requests were stonewalled by the treasurer, one of Diane's loyal board members, I cited specific statutes regarding financial transparency in homeowners associations. The reluctantly provided records revealed concerning patterns: maintenance funds allocated but services never rendered, administrative fees that increased yearly without explanation, selective enforcement of fines that seemed to target specific residents while overlooking violations by Diane's allies. Most troubling was a separate account labeled Legal Defense Fund with substantial deposits but minimal documentation of expenditures. Parallel to the financial investigation, I began quiet interviews with current and former residents. Finding former residents proved particularly valuable. They had nothing to fear from Diane and spoke more freely about their experiences. She had my flowering bushes removed while I was on vacation. A former resident named Janet Cohen told me over coffee at a cafe far from Oak Hills. Claimed they were non-approved species, though they had been there for years before she became president. When I complained, my car tires were slashed the next week. "Did you report it to the police?" I asked. Janet laughed bitterly. "Of course, they took a report and nothing came of it. No evidence," they said. This story repeated with disturbing consistency across multiple interviews. Property damage following disputes with the HOA. Police reports filed but insufficient evidence to pursue charges. Eventually, the targeted residents would sell their homes and move away, often at financial loss due to the urgency of their departure. One evening, I invited Marcus over under the pretense of showing him some vintage car magazines. Once inside, I carefully gauged his trustworthiness before revealing the true purpose of our meeting. "I am building a case against Diane Keller," I stated plainly, watching his reaction closely. "Not just for my car, but for what appears to be a pattern of harassment and possible financial impropriety within the HOA." Marcus glanced nervously toward the windows. "She has friends everywhere," he whispered, "people who report back to her." "I am aware of the risk," I assured him, "but I believe with enough evidence and enough residents willing to come forward, we can end this situation permanently." His expression shifted from fear to cautious hope. "What do you need from me?" "Names," I replied, "other victims who might be willing to share their experiences, and any financial records you might have kept regarding HOA fees and fines over the years." Marcus not only provided names, but offered to quietly reach out to those he trusted most. Within days, a small network began to form. residents sharing information through secure channels I established, building a comprehensive picture of years of systematic abuse. Tom and Lisa contributed HOA meeting minutes, showing how rules were created or modified immediately after disputes with specific residents. The Patels provided documentation of inconsistent enforcement, photographs showing certain homes with violations that received no notices while others were promptly cited. Most valuable was information from Sandra Miller, a former board member who had resigned in protest 3 years earlier. She had retained copies of original financial documents that differed significantly from those provided to me through official channels. The numbers were altered before the annual presentation to residents, Sandra explained, pointing out discrepancies. Construction bids were inflated, with the difference potentially diverted elsewhere, and the legal fund, I never saw legitimate invoices justifying those withdrawals. As my dining room wall filled with connected evidence, a clear pattern emerged. Diane Keller had created a sophisticated system of neighborhood control through intimidation, selective rule enforcement, and possible financial misappropriation. Those who challenged her authority faced escalating consequences until they eventually surrendered and moved away. The vandalism of my Mustang fit perfectly within this established pattern. My refusal to be intimidated by her initial warnings had marked me as a problem to be eliminated. What Diane could not have anticipated was that she had targeted someone specifically trained to build cases against criminals operating sophisticated schemes. A critical breakthrough came when Mrs. Wilson contacted me about additional footage from her doorbell camera. The night before my tires were slashed, the same figure had been recorded conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance, walking past my home slowly, studying the property. I did not make the connection until I reviewed older footage, she explained apologetically. We save everything for 60 days before it automatically deletes. With mounting evidence in hand, I began preparing for the next phase. My law enforcement instincts suggested that direct confrontation would be premature. Diane had operated this system successfully for years, which meant she was both clever and careful. I needed irrefutable evidence that would stand up to scrutiny not just by the HOA board, but potentially in civil or criminal proceedings. The next monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. According to multiple sources, Diane used these meetings to publicly humiliate residents who had challenged her authority. My sources indicated she had already placed me on the agenda under covenant violations discussion. The meeting would provide the perfect opportunity for what we in the Bureau called controlled confrontation, a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to elicit revealing responses from a subject under investigation. With 2 weeks to prepare, I gathered my growing network of allies to finalize our strategy. For the first time since the vandalism, I felt the satisfaction of an investigation coming together. Diane Keller believed she was dealing with an ordinary resident who would eventually break under pressure. She had no idea she was facing someone who had built cases against organizations far more sophisticated than her neighborhood fiefdom. The community center parking lot was unusually full the evening of the HOA meeting. Word had spread through my carefully established network, and residents arrived in numbers not seen in years. I purposely arrived last, parking my rental car at the far end of the lot to observe the scene before entering. Inside, the meeting room was arranged with military precision, rows of folding chairs facing a long table where Diane and her board members sat elevated on a small platform. The setting was deliberately designed to create a power dynamic, residents looking up at the board, positioned as supplicants rather than equal members of the community. I chose a seat in the back row, nodding quietly to several residents who had contributed to my investigation. We had agreed to act as strangers in public to prevent tipping our hand. Each participant knew their role in what was about to unfold. Diane called the meeting to order precisely at 7:00 p.m., her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. She wore a navy blazer with the HOA logo embroidered on the pocket, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp features. Before we address regular business, I would like to discuss recent covenant violations that require immediate board attention, she announced, shuffling papers importantly. First on our agenda is 1742 Oak Hills Drive. My address, I remained motionless as she continued. The resident has accumulated multiple violations including improper vehicle storage, unauthorized landscape modifications, failure to address exterior maintenance issues, and most recently, keeping a non-operational vehicle in the garage for an extended period. A murmur ran through the audience. The last charge was particularly galling. My vandalized Mustang was being cited as a violation. The board recommends immediate compliance actions, including daily fines of $100 until all violations are remedied, Diane continued, not bothering to look up from her notes. Do I have a motion to approve? One of her loyal board members immediately raised his hand. So moved. Second, added the other reliable ally. Any discussion before we vote? Diane asked perfunctorily, clearly not expecting any. I rose slowly to my feet. I would like to address these allegations. Diane looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she composed herself. The floor recognizes the resident of 1742 Oak Hills Drive. Please keep your comments to under 2 minutes. I walked deliberately to the front of the room, carrying a manila folder thaw. Tea contained only a fraction of the evidence I had accumulated. The weight of my FBI badge in my pocket felt significant as I approached the podium. Thank you, Madam President, I began in the measured tone I used when testifying in federal court. I would like to address each violation individually, beginning with the non-operational vehicle. As you know, I continued, making eye contact with various residents rather than the board, my 1967 Mustang was extensively vandalized 3 weeks ago. All 4 tires were slashed, and the paint was keyed along both sides. This criminal damage is why the vehicle remains in my garage awaiting proper restoration. Photographs of the damage appeared on the projection screen behind me. Marcus had quietly loaded them, while attention was focused on Diane. Regarding the other alleged violations, I continued calmly, I have documentation showing full compliance with all covenant requirements, including receipts for approved landscaping services and permit applications properly filed with the Architectural Committee. Diane's face tightened. Your time is nearly up and this does not address. I am not finished, I stated firmly. There is a more significant matter that concerns every resident in this room. This is not how these meetings are conducted, she snapped, reaching for her gavel. If you cannot adhere to the procedures, I believe everyone here would be interested in evidence that the president of this association is responsible for criminal vandalism and possibly financial malfeasance. The room fell completely silent. Diane's face went pale, then flushed with anger. That is a libelous accusation, she hissed. This meeting is adjourned until... I have video evidence placing you at the scene of the vandalism, I interrupted, nodding to Marcus, who played the enhanced doorbell camera footage on the projector. The grainy but recognizable figure of Diane approaching my house at 2:17 a.m. filled the screen. Before she could respond, I reached into my pocket and placed my FBI badge on the podium with a significant thud that resonated through the now silent room. My name is Special Agent Michael Johnson. While the vandalism of my personal property would typically be a local police matter, the evidence I have gathered suggests a pattern of behavior that may constitute multiple federal offenses, including mail fraud, financial misappropriation, and civil rights violations through systematic harassment. Diane's face had lost all color. Her loyal board members looked at each other in confusion, clearly unprepared for this development. That badge means nothing here, she finally managed, her voice lacking its usual authority. This is a private homeowners association matter. Perhaps this will clarify the situation, I replied, signaling Sandra Miller, who stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. As a former board treasurer, Sandra announced clearly, I can confirm that financial records presented to residents were falsified under Diane's direction. I have provided Agent Johnson with original documents showing discrepancies in the legal defense fund and maintenance accounts totaling over $200,000. One by one, other residents stood to offer their testimonies. Mrs. Wilson described finding my slashed tires in her doorbell footage. Tom and Lisa presented documentation of selective enforcement against residents who challenged Diane's authority. Marcus shared photographs of identical violations treated differently depending on who committed them. With each new speaker, Diane seemed to physically shrink in her chair. Her attempts to call for order went unheeded as years of pent-up frustration and fear poured out from the community. "This meeting is illegal," she finally shouted, desperation evident in her voice. "None of this follows proper procedure." I returned to the podium, my voice calm but authoritative. "I am not here in my official capacity tonight. I am here as a resident whose property was vandalized. However, the evidence presented does warrant further investigation by appropriate authorities." I turned to address the residents directly. The FBI does not normally involve itself in HOA disputes, but systematic harassment, possible financial fraud, and organized retaliation against residents who speak up potentially violate federal statutes. I have prepared files for submission to both local police and the district attorney's office regarding the specific criminal damages to my vehicle and other documented incidents. Diane stood abruptly, gathering her papers with trembling hands. "This is absurd. I have served this community faithfully for 8 years. Everything I have done has been to maintain property values and community standards." "Including vandalizing my car?" I asked quietly. "You have no proof it was me," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "The investigation will determine that." I replied, "In the meantime, I move that the board vote to suspend you from your position pending the outcome of that investigation." Her remaining ally on the board looked at her, then at the room full of residents with years of suppressed grievances now bubbling to the surface. Something in the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The fear that had maintained Diane's power had broken. "I second the motion," said the board member, who had previously supported all of Diane's initiatives without question. The vote that followed was unanimous, including the third board member who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. Diane Keller was suspended from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. As she gathered her belongings to leave, I noticed her hands shaking. The carefully constructed authority she had wielded for years had collapsed in a single evening. At the door, she turned back, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of hatred and fear. "This is not over," she stated, attempting to sound threatening but achieving only petulance. "You are right about that," I agreed calmly. "The investigation is just beginning." The morning after the HOA meeting, Oak Hills Estates witnessed something unprecedented in its carefully maintained streets. 3 unmarked vehicles and 1 police cruiser parked outside Diane Keller's colonial-style home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as officers carried boxes of documents to their vehicles. I observed from a professional distance, having made the official police report regarding the vandalism the previous night after the meeting. While I had no jurisdiction to investigate HOA financial matters, my detailed documentation had been enough to convince local authorities that a thorough examination was warranted. The detective in charge, a no-nonsense woman named Rodriguez, had been initially skeptical of what she called neighborhood politics until I presented the organized evidence. "This is more thorough than what most of my officers submit," she had commented, leafing through my case file. By mid-afternoon, news had spread throughout the community. The initial shock gave way to something unexpected. Neighbors began talking to each other openly, sharing experiences they had previously kept private out of fear. Lawn chairs appeared on driveways as impromptu gatherings formed. People who had lived beside each other for years without meaningful interaction were suddenly engaged in animated conversations. Tom and Lisa hosted an informal meeting in their backyard that evening, where over 30 residents gathered to discuss the future of the community. I attended briefly, but maintained a respectful distance from organizing efforts, conscious of not wanting to substitute one authority figure for another. "We need to establish an interim board until proper elections can be held," Marcus suggested to general agreement, "and review all the rules and fines that have been implemented over the past 8 years. The energy in the gathering was palpable, a community reclaiming its governance after years of intimidation. When someone suggested I should lead the interim board, I politely declined. "My professional role requires neutrality," I explained. "I can offer guidance on proper procedures, but leadership should come from within the community itself." Sandra Miller, the former treasurer who had provided key financial evidence, was nominated instead, along with 4 other residents known for their fairness and community involvement. The informal vote was unanimous, creating a temporary leadership structure until formal elections could be arranged. The following weekend brought another unprecedented event to my driveway. Marcus knocked on my door early Saturday morning, accompanied by several other neighbors. "We know how much that Mustang means to you," he said simply, "and we thought you could use some help restoring it." Behind him stood a small crowd of residents, some holding tools, others with car parts and supplies. Mr. Patel, whom I had barely spoken with before, stepped forward with a set of vintage Mustang tire rims. "My brother-in-law restores classic cars," he explained. "He had these in storage and offered them when I told him what happened." For a moment I was speechless, an unusual state for someone trained to maintain composure in all situations. These people, many of whom I had known only in passing before the confrontation with Diane, had organized this effort without my knowledge. The garage became a hub of activity as neighbors with various skills contributed to the restoration. Marcus coordinated the mechanical work with surprising expertise. Tom, a retired shop teacher, supervised the body repair. Even teenagers from the neighborhood participated, carefully sanding damaged areas under supervision before repainting could begin. While the work progressed, I received updates from Detective Rodriguez about the official investee. Financial auditors had discovered significant irregularities in the HOA accounts, including payments to a landscaping company owned by Diane's brother that charged premium rates for minimal service. "The vandalism case is straightforward," Rodriguez informed me during one phone call. "We found the key used to damage your vehicle in her home, with paint residue that matches your car's specific color. She will face criminal mischief charges at minimum." "And the financial matters?" I inquired. "That investigation will take longer, but preliminary findings suggest misappropriation of at least $150,000 over 6 years. The district attorney is considering bringing charges of embezzlement and fraud." Justice was proceeding through official channels, but the more immediate healing was happening in my garage and throughout the neighborhood. Streets that had once been eerily quiet, with residents hurrying from cars to homes to avoid potential violations, now featured children playing and neighbors conversing freely. The restoration of the Mustang became a symbol of the community's transformation. Each replacement part, each layer of new paint, represented the repair of something larger than just a classic car. It was the restoration of a neighborhood spirit, the reclamation of homes that had begun to feel like monitored facilities rather than personal sanctuaries. As the Mustang gradually returned to its former glory under the collaborative efforts of my neighbors, I found myself more integrated into the community than I had ever intended. The professional distance I had maintained between my work and home life had narrowed, not through the revelation of my FBI role, but through the shared purpose of restoring justice to a place that had forgotten what that meant. Autumn leaves drifted across freshly maintained lawns as I guided the fully restored Mustang down Oak Hills Drive. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that had transformed our community. The cherry-red finish gleamed in the October sunlight, not a trace remaining of the vindictive damage that had once marred its surface. The engine purred with the deep, satisfying rumble that my father and I had fine-tuned together so many years ago. The legal proceedings against Diane Keller had concluded with surprising efficiency. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the recovered key with paint residue and financial documentation, she had accepted a plea agreement rather than face a public trial. The terms included financial restitution to the HOA, 200 hours of community service, and a restraining order preventing her from serving on any homeowners association board for 10 years. I rarely saw her now. On the few occasions our paths crossed in the local grocery store, she would quickly turn down another aisle, her once-proud posture now hunched with the weight of public disgrace. The neighborhood grapevine reported she had listed her house for sale, though no buyers had yet been found. The interim board led by Sandra Miller had systematically reviewed and revised the community covenants, eliminating arbitrary restrictions while maintaining reasonable standards. The monthly HOA fee had been reduced by 30% once the inflated service contracts were canceled and replaced with legitimate local businesses. Most notably, the new board meetings took place in a dramatically different atmosphere. Gone was the elevated platform and confrontational seating arrangement. Meetings now occurred around a large circular table in the community center, with board members and residents positioned as equals. Discussions were collaborative rather than dictatorial, focused on genuine community improvements rather than punitive enforcement. The neighborhood itself had blossomed with newfound freedom. Gardens displayed personal touches that would have earned violation notices in the previous regime. Children played on front lawns without parents nervously checking for the approach of the HOA president. Weekend barbecues and impromptu gatherings had become common, creating the true sense of community that planned developments always promised but rarely delivered. As I drove slowly through the streets, neighbors waved warmly. The Mustang had become something of a local celebrity. Children pointed excitedly as it passed, and several residents had approached me about organizing a classic car show in the community park next spring. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, listening to the engine idle before reluctantly turning it off. The restoration process had done more than repair physical damage. The collective effort had transformed neighbors into friends and a housing development into a genuine community. The Mustang now carried not just memories of my father, but also the story of a neighborhood that had found its voice. Inside my home, the dining room table that had once been covered with investigatio. End materials now displayed the framed photograph taken at the completion of the restoration, me standing beside the Mustang, surrounded by smiling neighbors holding tools and paint brushes. It was a reminder that justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it arrives through formal legal proceedings and official channels. Other times, it emerges through community action and collective courage. My FBI training had taught me to build cases methodically and pursue justice through established systems. This experience had reminded me why those systems matter in the first place, not just to punish wrongdoing, but to restore balance and allow communities to thrive. As dusk settled over Oak Hill's estates, I glanced out my window to see children playing freely in the cul-de-sac, parents chatting on front porches, and neighbors walking dogs along sidewalks that once felt like supervised zones. The HOA still existed, but now it served the community rather than controlling it. And my 1967 Mustang sat proudly in the driveway, no longer hidden away in the garage, a gleaming symbol of resistance against petty tyranny and the power of standing up for what is right, even when it requires patience and strategy rather than immediate confrontation. Some battles are fought with badges and courtrooms, others with community solidarity and the quiet courage to say, enough. In the end, both forms of justice had their place in transforming Oak Hill's estates from a neighborhood ruled by fear to one guided by mutual respect, a transformation as complete and satisfying as the restoration of my father's cherished Mustang.